two-time TEDx and sought-after keynote speaker. She has worked at the TAS, which is the Tata Administrative Services, PepsiCo, and Texas Instruments, and currently runs her own business, CoAchieve. That business specializes in inclusive leadership and strategy. She is the 2017 ACT Journalism Award winner and an NAPW Woman of the Year. She serves on the boards of IIT NT, Design Connect Create, Prep Buddies, and TBIC. She is an alumna of IIT Madras, IIM Bangalore, and UT Dallas. Having said this, I think what we are missing is that, her entire journey has not been a terribly easy one. This is many, many years ago, which is when having a woman in IIT itself was a rarity. And, going from IIT to IIM also was pretty rare. And within there, because for us, TAS or Tata Administrative Services was the top job in a sense that time to get. So, and within that, getting there was a truly incredible achievement. I think India lost a bit when she decided to go to the US. And now, the kind of work that she does around inclusion and around, helping in boards and, making sure that, the whole process of people of looking at issues which are very, very important to us now, which is not just gender, but all forms of inclusion, has been a really remarkable thing and something which we can all learn from. So back to you, Debjani.
Wow, Ashish, thank you so much. Thank you. Wow, this is interesting. You've made me speechless just before I have to start speaking. Thank you really very much, Ashish. So what I'd like to do is, it's actually a privilege for me to now transition into the panel. As before, what we're going to do is I will introduce the panelists that I have not introduced, and I'm going to introduce them in the order of the questions that they're going to answer. They're going to actually bring the 4 levers of the book to life. So each of them will focus on one area. They'll take about 5 minutes to answer that question. So when we start with the panel, again, I would like to start with the order of the questions. So I'm the first one, and Ashish just gave a fabulous introduction. So now I'm going to introduce Shripad, and that is Shripad Nadkarni. It's unusual for me to have to use the full name because I know him and usually call him by a shortened version. Shripad Nadkarni is a serial entrepreneur and investor. He has helped create and nurture several brands such as Paperboat, Epigamia, White Owl, and the Moms Company. He was the founder director of MarketGate Consulting, which is a strategy and marketing consulting company acquired by the Publicis Group. Shripad was earlier head of marketing at Coca-Cola Southwest Asia and has also as the marketing head, and he's also spent several years at Johnson & Johnson. He is an independent director at the board of Liberty General Insurance Company Limited, and he is an alumnus of IIM Bangalore. So I would like to say welcome, Shripad. And as we go further, I'd also like to introduce our next panelist, and our next panelist is Geeta Goel. Geeta Goel is the country director, India, of the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and she is on the board of several investee companies, giving her a unique perspective of scaling in the impact space. She is also on the investment committee of the India Educational Investment Fund, the Education Catalyst Fund, and she has served as chairperson of the Impact Investors Council in India. In 2020, she was nominated by Forbes India's list of Women Power 20 Women Changing the Game. She is on the board of several investee companies and an alumna of IIM Ahmedabad. Welcome, Geeta. And of course, welcome again, Raji. So what I'd like to do is, as we transition to the panel, to just quickly go over some of the rules. So of course, each of the speakers has selected from the 4 levers what would be one question, and we'll be speaking for about 5 minutes. And then I'll give each of the panelists, I'm a little bit of a bad cop here, so I'll give you a 1-minute warning when it's about 4 minutes, just so that we kind of stay on track. And now the interesting thing is, so the 4 levers that Ashish talked about is about strategy, direction, is about breakthrough processes, and then about, within breakthroughs, processes, and finally culture. And so I have the interesting task of asking myself the first question, which is strategy. And so the question that I am asking myself is, in order to scale, how important is it for a company to know where it is headed and how to get there? And I asked for the strategy question because I bleed strategy. I mean, that's just innate to my nature, to who I am. And I'm thinking about the large companies where I've worked. And I'll start with an example from Texas Instruments, where I worked for 17 years. And one of the things that resonated with me most in Ashish's book is the logical way in which he set out the journey, the connection between mission and vision and the core strategies. So in Texas Instruments, at the beginning when I joined, it was a semiconductor company, and the focus, sorry, let me say that again. The focus first was defense. So it had to do with defense systems and, missiles. And I worked for a few years with that. And then they transitioned into the semiconductor space. And at that point, there was some confusion because it was like, are we a defense systems company or are we a semiconductor company? And there were a lot of strategy planning sessions where they finally decided we need to be very, very clear about where we're going. And they actually divested the defense piece of it and then focused solely on semiconductor. And that had a very strong impact on how they would move forward because they had a focus on one specific field and they could do excellently in that and then scale within that. The other thing that resonated with me in terms of strategy, he has the Alice in Wonderland, really good visual in his book, Ashish, where it says, if you don't know where you're going, then how do you know when you get there? I think in his 5 Ps, and those 5 Ps are really well thought out, the one that struck me the most in the context of strategy was perimeter. So it's not just having a strategy where you know where you want to go, it is crystal clear focus on what you do not want to do. So divesting or not doing the things that are not aligned with your strategy. And the way he's done it, sometimes people use mission a certain way, sometimes they use vision a certain way, but his main idea, the way Ashish has defined it, of mission being, the biggest picture in terms of the Disney example of making people happier, the bigger picture. And then going within that to more specific things, vision is kind of the way he has it. And then the core strategies, which are the 2 or 3 things. And I really recommend that you read the book and see the way he's laid out the connection between all of them. And so those would be some of the key points that I would say, that it is critical to start with strategy, to know how strategy connects to, strategy, structure, people, processes, reinforcement. It's a cycle that you have to keep going through that we learned. And right now, I just yesterday completed a strategic planning process for, Full Circle UTD, where I did my master's in org strategy for the Institute of Corporate Governance. And one of the things that is so critical, and I actually asked the leader of that organization to get Ashish's book, because there are such practical tools of how you take a strategy and then operationalize it into knowing where to go and also knowing what not to do so that you can scale successfully. So that's the first question that I'd like to answer. And then the second question, Shripad, we are going to go to you next. And ahead of time, I apologize if I'm going to mangle anyone else's name or pronounce anything wrong. The second question that we have has to do with breakthrough initiatives. And so the question is, can you, with your extensive background, can you share some examples of breakthrough initiatives that changed the course of a company and that helped it to scale?
Yeah, thanks, Debjani, first for the introduction and for the way you've been conducting this. It's amazing. What I'm going to do is share quickly 2 examples. One from a large company, which is Johnson & Johnson, where I spent about 17 years. And then from a local startup. So you'll see 2 extremes of the size scale. And I'll be quick. Johnson & Johnson, I'll talk about Stay Free, which is the sanitary napkin brand. And essentially, J&J was the dominant player till Procter's came with a better product with their brand Whisper. And very shortly, from a 70-80 share, J&J was around 30%, and Procter's went to 50 plus. Now they had a better product. The global pipeline meant that J&J couldn't have a better product for almost 2 to 3 years. Lead times were very long. So they had to really redefine the strategy if they had to survive. And fundamentally, the redefinition was where to play. Now, penetration of sanitary napkins or usage in urban India was very low. 10% of women were using sanitary napkins. So we decided to really convert homemade or cloth users, and that would be the strategy for the next 3 years. There was a huge potential because, like I said, usage was only 10%. And yeah, we would lose some share at the upper end, but totally we would gain substantially. It could not be a price game to be a truly breakthrough initiative because of one very peculiar thing about this market. And because barriers were not only economic, they were social as well. So women were telling us that I don't want to spend on myself, and that too on something which is going to be wasted, down the drain. So it was pretty culturally laid in this category. So what we did was we brought all levers into play to really convert cloth users. From a product, we had a basic product, which was far superior to cloth experience. From packaging, again, a very basic packaging with a 2-color plastic bag. Pricing was something we pegged at 20 rupees when Biswas was around 30. And in order to deliver that price, we had to bring every other lever into play. What J&J had was old machines which were written off, which could turn out basic product. And since they were fully depreciated, we made use of that to get the costs low. The supply chain is very interesting. Napkins are essentially made of wood pulp, and they are very expensive to transport because you're transporting air primarily. And hence we put up factories near ports so as to minimize the transportation cost. And distribution was the last lever, which was J&J was a very chemist-focused, chemist channel-focused company. We moved to Kiranas where the margins were lower from 20 to 12%. So everything was brought into play to deliver this breakthrough initiative of converting women from cloth to branded sanitary napkins. That really helped us because within 3 years, share moved from share almost got reversed from a 52-29. It got reversed to 57-29 in favor of J&J. So the open jaw curve that you see was something I had never seen before that. More importantly, I think penetration, which is number of users in urban India, moved from 9 to 32% in 3 years, and that was huge, which was one of the biggest breakthroughs. The important thing here is that the entire organization was focused on this as one of the most critical activities, and all business levers came into play. So this was the first example, and I'll go to the next one quickly, which is the startup Paperboat, which I'm associated with as an angel investor as well as from a strategy point of view. Now, Paperboat is a much loved brand in India. It's a brand of ethnic beverages. They have a great product, great packaging. The experience of the brand is very good. The business value of Paperboat is far lower than the brand value. So if you look at what kind of a premium people pay would pay for this brand, it would be far higher. And that the key issue was that it was a price point issue. They were priced at around 30 rupees, and it was 3 times more expensive than relevant competition like Maaza and Fruity, which were at 10 rupees. So while people loved the brand, they couldn't afford it. And at 30 rupees, the market size was limited. And there were early signs of growth slowing down because that was the limited opportunity that they were chasing. Now, what were the options? There was horizontal expansion to categories like ethnic food from beverages, which is something which they did. But again, price points were, they went into chickies and aam papad and things like that, which were ethnic food categories. But price would be a barrier there too eventually. Huge distribution expansion was the other opportunity which could be done. But again, it would be very expensive and with diminishing returns to get the affluent consumers across Indian cities. So we had to find a way of playing at the 10 rupee price point, like a Maaza and a Fruity, which was a massive market. It was a 40x market compared to what they were playing in. So it was truly massive. So the plan was to make sure that at 10 rupees, Paperboat had an offering which was profitable. R&D created a product which was superior to competition at the target cost. Packaging was 150 ml instead of 200 ml, which was Paperboat, and most soft drinks are at 200. But because these are juice drinks, the kind of satiety that you get with 150 ml is far more than a carbonated soft drink, for example, at the same, it's more watery. Distribution was again tier 1 and 2 towns, whereas Paperboat primarily focused on metro towns. So we kind of were a little worried about cannibalization. Eventually, it would come and serve the low price seeking consumer in the large towns. But to begin with, we focused on tier 1 and 2 towns. We needed to differentiate from a branding perspective, and we called it Paperboat Swing, a sub-brand, just to make sure that there was an arm's length distance between the core and the value brand. From a differentiation point of view, from a product differentiation, whereas Maza and Fruity and Slice were all focusing on mango, we said we will not go down the exclusive mango route from day one. We offered a range of fruit juice options. So we had pomegranate, we had Mossambi, and we had lots and lots of, so it became a brand of fruit juice drinks rather than just a mango. And mango would obviously be the single largest.
Nadu, we'll take a minute maybe to wrap it up. If
yeah,
you don't.
I'm almost done. So we launched this, and I think the impact it has had, when we talk about breakthrough initiatives, the impact it has had on the company is enormous. Within about 2 years, 2/3 of the business comes now from Paperboat Swing. And whereas Paperboat is about equity driving, I think this has driven volumes and revenue significantly. It has also driven distribution reach for the company. So if I were to summarize, I think breakthrough initiatives need to be a few, as Ashish said. I think they should help you take a giant stride towards your vision. If you can make all the business levers count, it's great. You need to get the entire organization aligned behind these key initiatives. And there needs to be a slight amount of risk going forward, else you're playing very safe. So that's really those are my thoughts on breakthrough initiatives.
Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. And you sort of are bringing that breakthrough initiative piece of Ashish's book to life with these real examples. And in addition, the sanitary napkin, that example that you gave also spoke about some of the cultural issues. So we're sort of transitioning really well into another piece, which will be the fourth question we're talking about, which Raji will talk about. In the meantime, what I'd like to do is to ask Geeta a question on the third lever, which had to do with management processes. So Geeta, the question that you selected is, do you think that process orientation is as important in social enterprises, which are more often driven by a very strong passion and social purpose? So can you share examples of how this may have contributed to the scale up of such enterprises?
Thank you, Debjani. And I must say, I'm a strong fan of Paperboat, but wasn't aware there's a Paperboat Swing. So that's my next buy. Yes, I mean, to your question on, is process important for social enterprises? I would say that's an emphatic yes, and possibly, the need for process orientation is much more in social enterprises that want to scale up versus the mainstream enterprises. And before I go into why, let me just say what social enterprises are so that we are on the same page. So these are for-profit revenue-generating entities that deliver, positively impacting goods or services to low-income populations. So it could be, after-school classes. It could be edtech ventures that are focused on low-income or first-generation learners. It could be, skilling ventures or job matching platforms that are aimed at low-income users, health services or affordable health services, and financial services. And I will dive deeper into financial services, which typically is called microfinance. But across the board, when you look at this category of companies, they are working on wafer thin margins. They are serving a target base where the affordability and the pricing is pretty much capped out. In order to be sustainable at these wafer thin margins, it is important that they scale up. So yes, I mean, I would like to clarify that there may be some mainstream ventures, some social enterprises, some non-profit social enterprises that do not want to scale up. But yeah, this discussion is more about scaling up. And in order for these organizations to scale up, I would say that the process clarity, the result orientation, and the target setting for each individual in the value chain just becomes extremely important. So let's take the example of the microfinance industry, where I have spent a fair bit of my time at the foundation. And we've been associated with a lot of these companies in the early stages of their existence, whether it was an Ujjivan or a Janalakshmi or a Swadhar. Many of these are now banks in India. And really, I would say the whole industry evolved and exists today because of the process orientation. Yes, there was a little bit of a product innovation there to begin with in terms of group guarantees, but to be able to manage doorstep delivery of credit, doorstep collection of cash, uh, you know, uh, giving small ticket size, high risk loans uncollateralized, would not have been possible if there were no clear goals, targets, KRAs at an individual level. So for instance, every loan officer in the organization, in most organizations, and I would say, I mean, this is true for 90%, and I'll come to the exception, but in most organizations would clearly know what their targets are for new loans, what the threshold are for dropouts, what the targets for renewals is, and again, what is the threshold for portfolio quality or outstandings which they do not collect. And they know their goals. They pretty much know the branch goals also. So I mean, typically in one branch there will be 5 or 10 microfinance loan officers. So they know their team goals, and each branch manager who manages this team of loan officers very clearly knows that I have 8 months to ramp up to be break even if I'm a new branch, or in the next 12 months I need to contribute X to the company's contribution level. So and that's how he or she then splits the goals towards each of the loan officers. uh, so that's, I would say, clarity on each individual's goal, the process they need to follow. So, literally there's a route map there. They know the meeting time is 15 minutes. Every client needs to attend the meeting. If there's absenteeism, how do I follow up? Like, I think the process mapping is so clearly defined. And I would say I entered the microfinance industry from the mainstream world. And I think just seeing the way the process mapping and clarity was there was a surprise for me. More so because, to your point, a lot of social enterprises start with a very strong passion and a purpose and the fact that you're doing good. And I don't want to be driven by process because, I want my individuals and my teams to flourish and be close to the customer. So you're starting with that angle. But I would say, process is equally important because none of the organizations that focus only on purpose and passion survive in the long run, especially in the social enterprise space, because you don't have the ability or the luxury to make mistakes, to reinvent yourself. I mean, going back to the point, funding is limited, margins are limited. And not to say that every microfinance institution is following the same process. So I would take an example. We invested in an institution in Uttar Pradesh, and they said we don't want to do cash collections on the field because of much higher risk of fraud, much higher risk of theft. So what they did was they customized the process that they still wanted the group meetings to happen. Each borrower to attend the meeting, mark their attendance, the loan officer to meet every customer every week. But the collection was done at the branch, or the collection was deposited at the branch by one client, and they had a rotating system for it. Again, they made a customization, but it was not an ad hoc customization. It was very clearly, a shift or a deviation, but documented and clarity for the entire team in Uttar Pradesh. I mean, I would say that we've also met, and these are some of the investments we didn't do, but we've also met entrepreneurs who said, when they're doing individual loans, that really the purpose of my existence is to include the excluded. So I don't want to go with a very strict credit scoring metrics, but I really want stories from the field. I want to see which are the borderline cases whom I could lend to and still be, a low risk lender. And I think it's fine to have that objective, but you cannot expect to be able to data mine from 200 stories a day. So yes, they started in that way, but quickly they realized they had to templatize the story. They had to start tagging the outlier cases so that they're able to study. So I would say the outlier cases, maybe to Shripad's point, was the breakthrough. They were trying to find that missing piece or the gap in the market and wanted to do a longitudinal on that. But at the same time, there was a process, like again, each office, like loan officer, knew how many loans they need to get in the regular category and what percentage could be in the outlier category. So again, I think back to individual targets, clarity around it, and the review and the compliance. So all these organizations are very, very strong on internal audits. So employees know that these processes will be reviewed. I will be evaluated. Part of my incentives are linked to my score on compliance, my branch's score on compliance. So I think that's where I would say it almost seems like a factory-like setting. And I know some people have said it feels like a sterile environment, but I would really say it's a process-driven environment, and you can layer culture on top of it. And we've seen, I think Ujjivan is a great example, which has a very, very strong employee culture, but very process-driven as well. So I don't think the two go against, or the two are not contradictory. The only other point.
If you don't mind, we'll do like maybe just a minute more and wrap it up, if you don't mind.
Sure. I would just say the only other thing I would say is often, and we as investors also make the mistake, that do these processes need to exist from the very start, or can they be built up later? I am of the firm view that the process orientation needs to begin from the start, because if you start scaling up and the processes are not there, you're always firefighting. And whereas, if you start in a more structured way, you are definitely creating organizations that are really built to last. So let me just pause there, given I got the 1 minute warning.
Thank you so much. Sorry to be the bad cop. And actually, in your closing, you actually answered one of the questions, which asks about scaling and says, should you do it at the beginning or should you develop it? So you sort of in that 1 minute did a 2 for 1. So thank you for that as well. What I'd like to do is then move on to the final question, which is I'm going to ask that of Raji, and that is in the section around culture and competencies. And the question is, at what point, Raji, in the organization does culture become important? And should you be hiring for skills or should you train your own people? So that's sort of a composite question.
So I'll pick up from where I think Geeta was using 2 words continuously, which is passion and process. Mm-hmm. And I remember our Chancellor, Dr. Karan Singh of our university, once telling us, he talked about a French philosopher, I don't remember the name, who said, and the question was, why is the world heading downwards or upwards? And the Hindu view is there's a transcendence, but the French view was we're going downhill because in the manufacturing defect of the human being, there's a disconnect between the head and the heart. And I want to touch on this. So when we talk of passion, we're talking of the heart. We talk of culture, we're talking of heart. We talk of process, we're talking of the head, logic, reasoning, and so on. So the heart and the head, he said there's a defect. They're not well organized. So exceptional organizations know how to balance this. The culture, and the passion, and the process. Now, the question was, when do you start looking at it? I think it's at every critical point in the organization, starting with the conceptualization and the founders. The genetic code is set by the founders. You look at a Hewlett and a Packard, look at a Larsen and a Trudeau, look at Mr. Sony, look at, you can, Mr. Tata, you look at the people, and they were there for a reasonable period of time. The culture was created by them. The culture, the value systems were their value systems. To me, bright people getting together to put a good set of values is fake. And there's a lot of that. Okay? It's when people who live their values, and then I think Ashish brings it out nicely that look around and see what the stories are. Don't say, here's a list of good values, because they won't be lived. And so he gives a good idea that look around and make stories and see what's happening and how is it happening. So culture becomes critical, or not critical. When is it formed? It's conceptualization stage, the founding stage. But then at every inflection point, because companies last well beyond their founders, good companies. And so the inflection points will be, for example, when a new CEO comes in when the founders are not around. And that's why we continue to say that the board's number one job is to find the right CEO. And I think in the question of right, where we need to invest more time before I talk about hiring or whatever people or skills is the CEO.
Mm-hmm.
So the CEO, does he share the values which are handed down? Or do we look at maximizing results alone at the cost of values? And there are many, many points in the inflection point where shareholders may force a change without recognizing the importance of the continuity of values. So disruption of values and strengthening of values happen at all inflection points. So merger and acquisition is an inflection point. You absorb a new company. So the company which is acquiring will reshape the culture of the acquired company, whether you like it or not. Even if there are more competent people down in the acquired company, we hear the stories that unless you have a sensitive person who values people, which may be the culture of the organization, and who may pull in someone from below, let's call it, because subsidiary is always below. Acquired companies, there is inferior status. So each of these inflection points is where culture gets strengthened or weakened. But it gets created at the time of founding and the early stages. And if I have to look, and as I said, Ashish, I think is recounted things extremely well. And to me, these answers are all there. But I have to go back to a point when we wrote our little document, which is 4 years old as a company. And we wrote a document in which we captured 10 statements in 3 parts. The first chapter, as we call it, is NIIT's people. And there are 4 statements on people. Then the second chapter is NIIT's quality and value. And there are 4 statements. And then quality, NIIT is a mission. There are 2 statements there. So we wrote this because we were then beginning to expand very rapidly. That's the inflection point. And we have to set up offices in different parts of the country at that time in 1986, 85, I would say. Ashish joined us in 83. And we had a really bright set of people. We were the biggest recruiters of IIM students, by the way, in the 80s. And I remember in 1984, we took 18 of the 19 people majoring in systems from IIM Calcutta, 18 of the 19. The 19th guy went to do business with his family. So anyway, and the reason was because there were examples of the Ashishes of the world who were changing their roles every 6 months, and we put stickers. We didn't do any big thing about this great company. We just said, hey, this guy joined 3 years ago, he joined 2 years ago, he joined 1, this is all he's done. So we could see growth. So I'm just trying to come to a point because when we look at, we said, okay, now we have to hire people. We have to grow very fast. We have to hire people. So what are we going to look for? That actually was an important trigger to write down what do we believe in, so that if a new person went to hire, whom we had hired using our criteria or whatever, which was in our heads and hearts, not in pieces of paper necessarily. So the thing really was, when someone goes to hire someone, or many people, opening office in Calcutta and so on and so forth, and you're going to hire a lot of people, what will guide you? And so the document that we wrote was written for that purpose. And so, for example, the fact that our first chapter was NIIT's people, which talks about our employees, and second chapter was quality and value, which talks about suppliers and customers and so on. This was 1985, and people told us, look, are you saying customer comes second? That sentence got popular only in the late 80s. There was a book by that name. And our view was very simple. We said that NIIT has to look after its people so that its people can look after its customers. The company doesn't look after people, look after customers. So we said our people have to come first, because if they don't have the capability and skill and attitude, how is NIIT going to look after its customers? So this document was written at that time for a purpose that we wanted to make sure. And then I remember that for middle to senior people, we at the final interview, before they came to meet any of us as founders, when they were waiting, we'd give them 15, 20 minutes, half an hour to read this document before they came in. And say, we've asked them, which of these things you believe in, which of these do you not believe in, and be frank, and let's argue it out. And we found more in those conversations about what people believed in. When we've done acquisitions, my co-founder Vijay Tharani used to say there's a math and there's a physics and there's a chemistry of acquisition. So the math is very simple, that you have to look at the financials here, there, all the assets and resources, and it has to add up, it has to be accretive and so on. That's the math. The physics is strategy, that, what competencies will you leverage? You have capabilities in the parent company. Can you multiply them through the acquisition? You have weaknesses in the acquisition. Can you add them? So that's the physics of it, the forces at work. But then came chemistry, that the people who own that new enterprise. And by the way, we were not one of those who said, fire those guys, fire the CFO, bring in. We wanted those people to be with us. In our early days, we said forever. And soon we discovered forever they didn't want to. Some of them wanted an out. But we still, even today, you have to stay for 2 or 3 years, and we work out earn-out systems, not only because we want them to deliver, but we want them to help us transform the culture both ways. There are some things we acquire. So performance as a culture was not our biggest strength in the good old days.
And I'm so sorry to hear that.
To get performance as a culture, to add it was a task. So every critical incident, or every, should we say, inflection point, is a point which either reinforces or weakens your culture. So in hiring senior people, currently we are hiring a new vice chancellor. I've done 11 interviews of that person, seen 46 people. So because the leader should strengthen the culture, is what we'll say. We're not saying follow the culture. Because if you're reflective, you know what your weaknesses are. So we've had to bring in at times leaders who we felt were much stronger in the performance ethic. And we had to deal with the problem because we found them erring on the side of results rather than values. And so, but we had to modify it. And so you have to strengthen. So each of these is a very important inflection point. So that is where I think culture gets created, was the first question. And also, for example, when we had to go to new countries like China, who will head that place? When we started a business to do computer education for kids in government schools in the interiors. And I'll tell the story and maybe that'll answer. So a person who was heading a software business in Chennai, a guy called Bala Subramanian. So when we were thinking of doing the schools business, which is you're going to go into the hinterland where nothing exists, we had a model, we had a strategy. So then we floated the thing in the company and said, who wants to run this project? And this project is about, the digital divide problem. And we got very good people from the learning business, and we had a software business. We got Bala, who knew nothing about learning. And when I was talking to these few people, I said, Bala, why do you want to do this? You know nothing about this business. And I can never forget the short discussion. He says, Raji, I come from a village. And if I hadn't got an exposure in education, I wouldn't be sitting here with you as a head of business in the south of this country. And he says, this project, which is going to take the high quality education of NIIT into rural areas, will provide this opportunity for thousands and like to give an arm and leg to this.
Wow.
You can never go wrong with a thing like that. So I think choosing leaders, China, country leader, again, the same choice. We needed someone daring. We had to take a guy who was in Chennai, Prakash Menon, and he would deal with the unknowns.
Wow.
But he was a great adherent to our values. We could swear. I had to say that people like Ashish defended the values of the company better than I did. I have to say that. And that's how it grew. So in fact, they would challenge us. Look, you say this, but you're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And so we found a lot of truisms in this. And one of them was that make yourself vulnerable to your followers. That's the hallmark of a leader. And so we used to have challenge the vision sessions. And I would go to city after city, and this was post-dinner. No conflict with your appointments. And we had this list, and everybody would say, okay, I want to talk about this value. You say this, but this is what we do. And this we started when we were doing the quality movement.
Speaking for the rest of the entire session is just so fascinating. And the questions are just pouring in. So I feel so bad. I'm torn between having to move on to the questions. I could just keep on hearing you speaking.
So we'll stop here. We talk about what people want us to talk about. Ashish, you remember? This was Philip Crosby's line. He said, let's talk about what you want me to talk about. So,
well, you have talked about all the things that we wanted to hear anyway. So thank you all the panelists for these wonderful answers. The questions are just rushing in. And so what I'd like to do is in the order in which some of them have come. First of all, I hope that all of you learned tremendous amount of knowledge that I did from hearing the panelists, as well as, of course, Ashish's overview. Shripad, the first question is for you. And the question is around scale. And again, we were saying, please type into the chat box as well as in the Q&A. And Shreya is making a note of the questions so that if we don't get to all of them, because we have about 15 minutes left, then one of them, either Ashish or Shreya, will disposition the questions. So Shripad, your first question around scale is, how do you figure how big is big enough? So in other words, is scale more to do with ambition, or is it more to do with competence?
The short answer to that question is scale has everything to do with ambition. And I think which is why the vision comes first. Where do you want to reach is the starting point, and everything else then gets aligned. The competencies for reaching where you need to reach have to be appropriate. The kind of initiatives have to be appropriate to that vision. So everything else is subservient to where you want to reach. And so it's a question of your ambition, really.
Thank you very much. Short and sweet. Geeta, the next question is for you. And the question has to do with the Dell Foundation. And it's like, does the Dell Foundation help their investor companies improve their processes?
Yes, we do. We do help them hire or engage with consultants, firms, etc., provided the management team and the founding team, feels that process is important. Otherwise, it's a wasted opportunity.
Thank you very much. The next question is actually for me. And the question, it's almost like I paid someone to ask this question. It's so dovetailed to me. Should companies bring inclusiveness into their strategic direction? And if so, how? So the answer is, of course, emphatically yes, companies should bring inclusiveness. But what I've been noticing recently is there are two kinds of companies. There are companies that, kind of the point that Raji made, you can talk about values and you can say, oh yeah, this is a list of values, blah, blah, blah. But there are companies who use inclusiveness as a political tagline, and they don't actually believe that inclusiveness is necessary for business results. And so they just have that as a nice to have, but it isn't part of business strategy. So if business strategy doesn't have, see, what is inclusiveness? It's leveraging human capital. You're trying to make sure that every individual in your organization gives discretionary effort. And yes, it's the right thing to do. More important, or just as important, it also results in effective business practices. So when you're trying to scale, you want that person who on their own works later or figures out a smarter way to do it because they feel valued. And by the way, the increasing of inclusion is different from decreasing exclusion. Decreasing exclusion is recognizing the bias and the stereotype and getting rid of them and saying zero tolerance for racism, sexism, religious intolerance. That's one piece. The other piece of it is saying that you are valued how you are. And because of that, you will bring more of your business effort, and that will really help the organization scale. So my answer is an emphatic yes. Inclusion has to be actually part of the business strategy, not a political tagline to say, hey, look, this is what we're doing, and I've won 1 or 2 diversity awards. So that's my response. Raji, the next question is for you. And the question is that about NIIT. It says NIIT is known for its values. Has there ever been a time when you questioned one of your values?
As I said, we used to do this challenge. The document was called Vision, but it was a part of a bigger thing we had done, which was to say where do we want to head. But there was a chapter on values. So we used to challenge the values, but I have to say that I didn't quite ever confront a situation where a value was considered unimportant. The real question was, are we living values the way we state? And so the conversation which I was keen to encourage, and when I say it's my senior colleagues as well, we go into a team anywhere and say, okay, let's talk about, is that, okay, we say that, so for example, we had one line there, we recognize the necessity of making mistakes when it contributes to innovation and growth in each one of us. So this was challenged by many people. Are you encouraging us to make mistakes? We said, push yourself to the limit of your knowledge and then take a bet. And so long as you don't do the same mistake 3 times, then you're being careless. But when it contributes to learning, innovation, and growth in each one of us. So a lot of that was explanation, but people did point to situations where someone in the organization wasn't living a value. And so the challenge for me used to be, what do we do in that circumstance? And we had to take some really, really, really tough decisions. Fortunately, not too many. Ashish makes a reference to one, which is that we will honor every commitment irrespective of what it costs. And we've had a situation where my co-founder went with a checkbook to the customer and said, I think we've done harm. So I've signed it, write the amount you want.
Wow.
Real story. Shekhar Bajaj Electricals.
Wow.
They became a customer for life.
Wow, that's an incredible
Fortunately,
story.
it didn't happen too often because people soon realize that if something blows up, these guys will go with a checkbook and give it to the customer. But there was a customer, I won't go into the story, in Bangalore who did take a check and still used the software, but that's a separate story. But I think it's these moments which were more important than are we missing something? Because I think we had thought this through extensively, had worked on putting this together. And I think Ashish captures the process of, you don't write values, you have shared values. So shared values, and how do you do that is a process of rolling it out and bringing it in, and then living them by challenging them continuously. So
I'm going to actually ask you a follow-up question because it's related to what you just answered. So if you don't mind, Raji, I'll ask you another question. And the person has asked, are the values important primarily during the startup stage and then become not so important later? So, and how do you stop erosion of values? So it's a kind of a 2-part question.
Yeah, so I think, as I said, values is not something you're getting from outside. Values are what you're expressing. So as I said, if Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard believed in something which became there. In fact, the Johnson & Johnson credo, I studied this thing extensively, all of these, much later, not when we had written it. So the founders create a set of values. And if it's a company where the founders are there for a long enough time, and you keep doing the balance of passion and process, because the company does swing from passion to process, it happens. It's happened in our case as well. And you have to then go back to the drawing board. So in the beginning, it's very, very important for founders to try and put this down on what they believe in. Now, we've had many moments when we said, okay, now we should relook at our values and say, are they relevant? And I have to say, I went around, so did many colleagues, asking, should we change something? And people at the end of the 3-hour discussion, having thought of something, would say, no, let's stick to what we have. So I think it's very important to set it down. And of course, if a transaction happens and a part of your company is sold, we sold a software business. And there's a new set of owners. And I'm aware that it's affecting the values. And I'm not saying it's worse, but it's different. And that some people are extremely uncomfortable and some people are extremely excited. So things will change when there are these episodes or this transaction. But otherwise, I think it's best to put it down and to keep revisiting it. I would say revisiting it. So in our case, it just so happened that we didn't have to rewrite it. But one should be open. I would say one should be open. The leaders of the moment are living a behavior. They should have integrity to translate it into values if they think they're doing something else, is what I would say.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of questions and they're open. And so I'm going to ask the question and see if either Shripad or Geeta or Ashish, if you would like to field this question. So the first question is, for an entrepreneurial company, when do you think that it is wise and economically profitable to take it public? I'm thinking Shripad, Ashish, any of you actually. You might be mute, Ashish.
I was just saying maybe Raji and or Geeta would be the best people to answer this question. The rest of us haven't done very much of it.
Geeta, would you be comfortable answering that question?
Yes, I guess when you're tired of your equity investors and you want a broader public holding, I mean, that is a good time. But I mean, jokes aside, it is a big step in a company's journey. And I mean, besides, obviously the investment bankers would advise on the size, etc. But I think when you're ready to take the plunge of extremely high compliance and transparency, so I mean, that itself may be a culture shift for many organizations. So I think both from a process and a culture perspective, when you feel you're ready to make the shift, and I mean, clearly the size and the profitability will be thresholds for it. And in the long run, it may be easier to manage public shareholding than a set of equity investors who are looking at, constant shuffling of the portfolio. So every 3-4 years, you need to churn your investors, and instead a public may be better. So.
Thank you very much, Geeta. There's another question, and the question is, in your experience, how will you prioritize the sales and marketing compared to improving products and services? And that question is of any of the panelists or of Ashish.
Okay, I'll try and get that. I mean, I think my view is that you have to do sales and marketing on priority. You can keep doing products till you're blue in the face, but it becomes a sort of a vicious cycle because you can always keep perfecting it, but you have to take it out into market and you have to test it, and then you can keep refining it. And of course, that must happen. But if you don't sell it and if you don't get customer experience, then all doing products it doesn't have much value.
Thank you very much, Ashish. And there's a fairly long question. Again, it's for any of the panelists, so I'll read it out. When you decide at some point in the journey to focus your business on your core strength, and you have to take a tough decision to kill a line of business that has been an important rung in your ladder in the past, how do you take along your people in such a decision? People from down the line on the field all the way up to even the board of director members. I should warn you, I'm a patient person.
No, I think you should just decide who will take it. I mean,
whether you go age-wise or height-wise, I'll come last. So you.
Okay, Raji, I'll have you feel this one.
So, I think there's a rational side to doing a portfolio assessment, and there's an emotional side. I think that's the question that's coming up. And I have to admit that many decisions are not rational. And I think this is where this thing is coming from. And I have to admit that I've done these mistakes myself as well. So if you are a privately owned company and you want to do an airline, you can do an airline. No one's going to stop you. Unless you have private equity investors who will do some physical damage to you. But if you're a listed company, and we got listed when we were 10 years old, but it took me many more years to understand the responsibility. I think Geeta made that point as well about, and I was very affected by something I read once, which is that the role of the board or the chairman should be concerned about the widow who has one share.
Mm.
And that reminded me of the famous story of Gandhi and Nehru, when Nehru went to Gandhi and said, look, you won't be around, and how will I take this tough decision? And he had said something similar. He said, close your eyes. Think of the poorest and most challenged person you saw in life, and then say, will this decision be good for that person or not? It's the same story. So when you have a listed company and you have shareholders, then the fact who has most is the worst thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But logic says so. I mean, when people come and do big holding and they want to drive the decision. So to me, at that time, I think that again becomes a question of values.
Yep.
But at that time, you have to worry about shareholders.
Yep.
And you have to worry about your view. And you have to take that into consideration. And classically, I talked about the schools business. Yep. Eventually, we had to shut it down because after the first generation of chief ministers who wanted to deal with digital divide, and we were in 26,000 schools, you trained 13 million children who could never have got computer education. The second and third round of CMs had no interest, and it went down, down, down and got delegated. And then you know what happens in government purchasing. And we stopped getting our money. So then my independent director said, now it's not good for shareholders. And we were torn. We said, look, there's one thing we've done well in our lives is this one. And then my independent directors, and we've always had more independent directors, and we've never had to vote. They said, if you have a passion, do something with your money, not with your shareholders' money. So first is a question of taking the decision, which is tough, right? We have to make a choice. Of course, we now have foundations in our own name, then we do stuff. But that's the first question. Then you have to carry people along, because that's again a question that, where do people rank? So when we've had to do it, we've had to do it at a pace at which we can absorb our people. And you can't absorb all, you have to take those hard calls as well. But very often you will move people across, even though they're not the best. But they've been with you for 10 or 15 years. They have an understanding of the company. They can be good leaders. So therefore, carrying people along, and none of this is a black and white decision. And it will be shaped again by, your value systems.
Thank you so much. I see that we are at time. So what I'm going to do, there's a question for Shripad, and I'll say thank you in advance to the people that had to leave at this moment. And we'll continue for just a few more minutes because the questions keep rolling in. So Shripad, I'm going to ask you this question. And the question is, in your varied career, where have you learned from a specific failure or missed opportunity that you would go back and change some of the decisions that you made?
So I think in the current phase, the most difficult phase of my career has been the startup phase. Johnson & Johnson, Coke was a breeze. Consulting was fun, but startup really makes you unlearn and relearn everything many times over. And I think one of the biggest, we bet on an idea, which is that in India, food would move from home cooking to ready to cook as the first step before moving to ready to eat eventually. And we launched a brand called Fingerlings. And 2 years after launch, and we got in investors and VCs, and it was going steadily. There was a fundamental shift in the marketplace, which was Zomato and Swiggy had come in and were driving, driving volumes in the ready-to-eat category. So we felt we were missing something, and that's why we. Raji talked about shutting down some businesses. Here was a complete, to use the technical startup term, pivot to a very different business. Of course, we leveraged some bit of the operational and distribution learnings that we had in especially supply chain. But it was a fundamental shift to go to something completely different, which I had never done earlier in my career. Earlier were small shifts because J&J, Coke were fairly large, well-established companies. But this was I think a seminal moment for us in our existence, and it taught us a lot. We had some hard decisions to make, but we have a set of values which we govern ourselves by, and that was something which came really useful when we made those changes. And Raji talked about the Credo, and I've lived through 17 years of the Credo. It's one amazing document which I would recommend everybody should read because it's phenomenal. But yeah, there are what comes to the fore at these times is the core values that you really believe in and espouse.
Absolutely. I heard Goel speaking recently at a conference I was speaking at, and he started with the Credo. That's always the way. Geeta, as we close, would you like for a couple of minutes to just kind of share anything that we didn't ask you, any insights that you may have just before I hand it over to Ashish?
No, I think we covered it. I think it was a very interesting discussion, and Debjani, you did a great job moderating it. So thank you.
Ashish, with that, I would first of all say thank you so much to the panelists, so much. Thank you to the audience, and hand it back to you, Ashish.
Thanks. So I have the pleasurable task of thanking everyone. So first, let me start backwards. First to the audience. Thank you for being so patient and for listening to all of us. I certainly learned a lot from all the panelists. I hope you all did too. And thanks for all your questions, all your interactions, all your wishes. It was wonderful to actually just be through this and keep watching the chat and all of that. Thank you, Debjani, for such a wonderful job in moderation. You kept us all honest. You made sure that things were happened in time, and your insights on for strategy were nice as well. Geeta, as always, it's always a pleasure, listening to you and getting an input on, how the social sector actually behaves and functions and performs. And, what is in your whole talk about, the fact of process being important and it being vital even for profits, I agree completely. And that was very insightful. Shripad, again, thank you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your marketing wealth of marketing knowledge and information. I think everyone benefits a lot, especially because you worked on such a diverse set of brands. And Raji, what can I say? Whenever I've asked you for any kind of help or support or mentoring or guidance, you've always been available. And this is a good 10 years after, maybe 12 years now, after I've actually left NIIT. And at any point, whenever I reach out to you, you're always available to support. I think that always speaks a lot to me about the values of the company and values of NIIT and the values that the founders brought to NIIT and NIIT University. So it was a wonderful session. Thanks all of you. And I guess with that, we can bring this session to a close. Thank you.
Just one more sentence, which is thank you to Shreya. Raji started it by mentioning her. And I do want to close by saying Shreya is the glue that stuck us all together. So I want to appreciate her in closing as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debjani. Thanks, Geeta, and nice meeting you and Shripad.
Thanks.
Shreya, thank you very much. Great job.
Well, with that, we are concluding. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Bye.